And I never realized the importance of that story until I read those history books about the Pomme de Terre and stuff. That was only 7 years after the Indian Uprising. So I can't imagine how terrified she must have been to turn around and see that Indian standing in her doorway. But she chose the kind thing, and so they went on trading for years. That's the only trading story that's been passed on. But down in the pasture, there's a tree where the Indian used to tie his horse when he would come and trade with her. And probably 15 years ago, when my dad's cousin was here and we started walking down to the lake, and he started to tell that story, and I said, Donnie, which tree was that? And he pointed out the same tree that we'd been shown when we were kids. So like I said, that's a one-time story of the trading that went on, but I think it was a lifelong thing that went between them. So when they moved here, they had two sons, Edward and Torval. And in 1870, then a year later, they had Anton. And then I don't remember what year Sophie was born. And then they had Sophie, and she married a Krogan. So Edward is the one that I descend from, and he married Annie Honorud, which you'll hear about over at Annie. And they had 10 children. So it was, and Karen lived here until she died, and she died in when she was about 73, about. And so she lived here her whole life. But so she was left here to raise 4 kids by herself. And there's a story in one of the newspapers in Morris, if you look up her name, and it talks about her and the neighbor lady, which was her sister-in-law, who was also widowed. There was a prairie fire coming from the south, and they hitched up their horses and they plowed up part of their field. But if you think that through, first of all, it's a woman wrestling a one-bottom plow by herself, which is huge. But second of all, what it took to break that ground up in the first place, to plow that up, plant it, and they had a crop growing and she had to plow that up. I just can't imagine how devastating that must have been, because it was their food, it was their barter, it was everything. Mm-hmm. But they did that to save their homes, which they did. And so there's not a lot of stories from then until when Edward and Annie got married. Annie was a midwife, and she delivered a lot of her grandchildren. At one time she had a daughter and a daughter-in-law pregnant at the same time, and they must have moved in when they were due, because one child was born upstairs and one was born downstairs. So I always thought that was kind of cool. And she, later in life, Annie did, had gangrene from diabetes and lost her legs. But she was such a spitfire. They said she used to, once in a while, they would catch her like just about out of the house. She'd gotten out of bed and gotten out there with her stumps, and she wasn't supposed to do that apparently. And they said she used to paint smiley faces on her stumps so the kids weren't scared of her stumps. But
hey Jeannie, can you tell how Karen got to be a widow?
Oh, yep. So Karen, they moved here in 1869, and Eric, her husband, in 1873, sometime during that winter, in December, I believe, was walking to town to Morris to get food ground into flour and get supplies and stuff. And a storm came up on the way back home, and he lost his way down on the slough, and they found him. So there's another discrepancy. They either found him dead the next morning, or they found him and they brought him into the house, and when they warmed him up too quick, and the cold went in and stopped his heart. So either way, he died from that storm. So she was left widowed to raise these 4 kids by herself. And there's some of my dad's cousins, when I first started really asking questions about history, there were some of my dad's cousins that were old enough that remembered Karen. And so I asked them what did they remember about her, and the common theme was she was never idle. She was doing something all the time, and oftentimes two things at a time. Like if she was rocking a baby, she was doing needlepoint or whatever. She just didn't know how to be still. And so when they did that postcards interview about this place, he kept asking about Eric, and I said, I think you're missing the real story. I think it's her, because if she wouldn't have been so strong, neither one of us would be here, you know, because he was also a great-great-grandson of Eric Harstad. And so I think it kind of made him think about, there was a very strong woman that carried on our family, which was kind of cool. So this is my grandmother, so that's my dad's mom, and Agnes, and she married an Erickson, and they lived over on County Road 20, so that's where my dad grew up, and that's another 5-generation family farm. And Otto, their youngest son, so Edward died, I don't remember exactly the year he died, but Annie lived a number of years after him, and she died in 51. And Otto was then married to Jessie, who anybody who went to Donley School might have had her for a teacher, Jessie Harstad. And so, but they got married when they were older, and they never had children. And so when Otto died, then Jessie sold the farm to my mom and dad. So they bought it in 1954, and we had 5 kids, and in 1975 my mom said, because it was a 4-room house, not 4-bedroom house, 4-room house, it was very small, and my mom said, we're either adding on or I'm moving out, because she said this house is just too small for all these kids. So they found a house over by Cyrus, and they moved the whole house in, and it matched the house, the dimensions and stuff. It was a perfect fit, and so they added on that whole house. And then that December 11th of 1975, we had a house fire, and my dad and brother died in that house fire. And my mom made 2 decisions that day, and I don't know if it was intentional or it just happened, but she chose to not move us out of the house, which I think was a good choice, because I think it would have been so much harder to come back to the house. And by that night, a neighbor had built us bunk beds, so we had beds in the living room, and we had lost our dog in the fire, and somebody brought us a puppy. Somebody brought us a Christmas tree because it was 2 weeks before Christmas. Somebody took a bunch of laundry home. People just wrapped around us, and I think I made 2 choices that day too. First of all, even though CPR wouldn't have saved my dad, I decided that everybody should know CPR, so I've kind of made it my life's work. I've been an EMT for 39 years because everyone should know CPR. And I know now that it wouldn't have saved my dad, but it saved our neighbor a few years ago. And ironically, he was 51 and his son was 12, and when Dad died, he was 50 and I was 12. So that same story had a different ending because CPR worked. So a year after our fire, the EMT course became available to the general public, and so 4 guys that Daddy worked with, he worked at the elevator in town, and 4 guys that Daddy worked with said, we don't ever want to be in that position again to not know what to do. So they went to the city council and they said, we want to start a rescue squad. So they took the training. Wrensville 4-H Club, of which Teresa was a huge part of, every year put on a carnival to raise money to buy equipment for our first responder team. And we were the first responder team in the state of Minnesota. So out of something bad, something always can happen too. So my mom, almost 100 years, almost exactly, was widowed on this same farm place, left to raise 4 kids by herself, and again, was an amazingly strong woman. She was so competent. You'd come home one day and she'd have the wash machine tore apart. You'd come home another day and she'd have a batch of cookies or donuts or whatever, and She truly could do anything, and I feel like our story could have been a lot different had we not had her for a mom. And so we were fortunate. Edward and Torval and Anton and Sophie were fortunate because they had her for a mom too, I believe. And so Mom lived here until her youngest child graduated in 1990. And then because of failing health and stuff, she wanted to sell the farm. So my husband and I and our kids bought the farm in 91, excuse me. And so our boys were 2 and 5 at the time. So they also got to grow up on this farm. And now their little girls get to play here too. So we've been here 31 years, and I can't imagine living anywhere else. So, do you have any questions?